pray with me? Into our slumber, God, send salvation. Into our darkness, God, send a light. Amen. In August of 2012, my wife, Alyssa, traveled to the town of Görlitz, Germany, with members of her extended family. They were coming from the US, they were coming from Israel. It was a family reunion and a homecoming of sorts, yet it was a somber one. For many members of her family hailed from Görlitz many decades ago, but fled the town when Nazis began rounding up, interning, and killing members of Jewish families like her own. The trip to Görlitz provided an opportunity for remembrance, for grieving, for healing for this family. But it wasn't through an elaborate ceremony. It wasn't through a large memorial. No, this remembrance came in the form of 2 4-inch squares. These are 4-inch squares called stumbling stones. These stumbling stones have become one of the most significant ways to memorialize those who were killed during the Holocaust in Germany and beyond. There are over 5,000 of these stumbling stones right now. And these small stones, they're planted within the sidewalks. They're placed strategically right in front of the last residence where a victim had lived. For Alyssa's family, they had gathered to witness that laying of 2 stumbling stones, one for her great-grandfather, Carl Jacobson, and one for his son, Hans Jacobson. The idea behind these stumbling stones is quite powerful. One simply stumbles across them. They stumble across them while out in the midst of your everyday life, perhaps while out for a casual stroll, taking kids to school. The stumbling stones appear in one's path without any warning, without a prior decision, without any readiness, really. The artist who creates each one is named Günter Demnig, and he describes these stones in the following way. I think the large Holocaust memorial here in Berlin will always remain abstract. You have to make the decision to visit it. But not so with the stumbling stones. Suddenly they are there, right outside your front door, at your feet, right in front of you. The stumbling stones of Germany, they interrupt us from our daily routine. They swoop into our consciousness when we're not necessarily ready for them. They cause us to readjust, to realign, to pause, and to remember. The idea behind the stumbling stone leads me to think that sometimes the greatest transformation, the greatest healing, the greatest hope can happen in the moments that catch us most off guard, that awaken us from whatever slumber we might have been lulled into, that stumble us into a new vision and a new consciousness. And so it is today with our Hebrew Bible reading from Isaiah 35. You may remember hearing some of the poetic and bountiful imagery in this poem that makes up the chapter of Isaiah 35. It is the promise of a new world order where there is blossoming and abundance, even in the harshest conditions. The chapter begins right off the bat with such abundance and fruitfulness. It starts with, the wilderness and the dry land shall be glad. The desert shall rejoice and blossom. Like the crocus, it shall blossom abundantly and rejoice with joy and singing. Like a stumbling stone that jolts a casual walker out of her predictable routine and narrative, the promise that we read in Isaiah 35 is a surprising poem. It's a surprising poem that feels contextually completely out of place. For you see, the beautiful and hope-filled poem that makes up Isaiah 35 pretty much makes zero sense when read in the full context in which it appears in the book of Isaiah. The first 40 chapters of Isaiah are usually attributed to one author, referred to as First Isaiah. And First Isaiah, these first 40 chapters, center around the theme of corruption, of ethical and political corruption of the time. These first 40 chapters of Isaiah are written against a backdrop of fear, suffering, and conflict. An oppressive power has already conquered 10 out of the 12 original tribes of Israel, and those that remain have lost sight of God. So this is the context in which our beautiful, bountiful Isaiah 35 occurs. It's amid rumors of war, of desolation, and bam, in swoops Isaiah 35 to surprise us. And surprise us it does, for these words that are preceding it, those of Isaiah 34, are dismal ones. It's a narrative walk filled with ecological destruction. The streams of Edom shall be turned into pitch, it reads, and her soil into sulfur. Her land shall become burning pitch. Thorns shall grow over its strongholds, nettles and thistles in its fortresses. But then, like a small, powerful, stumbling stone, without a warning, without an explanation, Isaiah 35 interrupts this narrative stroll. It catches us off guard. Blossoming, abundance, rejoicing, where does this come from? This message of abundance, it feels so out of place in a time of fear. The style, the theology of it, that feels out of place as well. That is from a later time. So what in the world is Isaiah 35 doing there? Reverend Barbara Lundblad, who is one of my preaching heroes, describes it in the following way. There are some things even our best scholarship cannot explain, she writes. It's as though the Spirit hovered over the text and over the scribes and said, put it here before anyone is ready. Put it here. Interrupt the narrative of despair. And so here it is, Isaiah 35, a word of hope that simply couldn't wait until it might have made more sense. A word that stumbles us out of our despair and fear. A word that didn't wait until the rest of the world was ready for it. This kind of word feels quite a bit like our Christmas story. This inbreaking of God into our world when no one was quite ready, in the places where we least expected it. The voice of John the Baptist cried out in the wilderness, but was anybody ready to hear it? At first, Mary didn't think she was ready. At first, Joseph didn't think he was ready. The town of Bethlehem, they sure weren't ready. But whether or not the world is ready, whether or not the narrative is conducive to it, whether or not anyone is listening for it, God's voice surely breaks in, causing us to stumble out of our complacency, stumble out of our slumber, stumble out of whatever story we had been dwelling in before. Isaiah 35 shows us one of the ways that God works most powerfully in this world, jolting us awake when our narrative of despair lulls us to sleep, stumbling our steps when our stroll gets too casual, bursting in with new life in conditions that seem completely unready, uninhabitable, unwelcoming, this backdrop of fear, this narrative of destruction. This is where God often does her very best work. This backdrop of fear, this narrative of destruction. I read the words of Isaiah 34, those lines leading up to today's poem of promise, and they truly sound like something right out of our own newspapers this very day. Streams shall be turned into pitch, Isaiah 34 reads. And indeed, here we are. Oil pipelines are in fact turning streams into pitch, leaking oil into our environment in a way that feels irreversible and unstoppable. And the land shall become burning, Isaiah 34 reads. And indeed, here we are. Our planet is warming due to climate change, and large wildfires are leaving us with more and more burning land. And while these weren't wildfires, today we bring our heavy prayers to God for those who suffered from devastating fires in Oakland and our neighboring Cambridge this very weekend. And all of this against a backdrop of fear and what feels to some, to many, to be a great political threat. Indeed, here we are. A prophecy indeed, for these can feel like Isaiah 34 times. And frankly, in Isaiah 34 times, the joy of Christmas, the promise of Isaiah 35, it can feel out of place. It can feel jarring. It can feel like it belongs in another book or at another time. We're not always ready for it. And maybe right now we're not feeling ready for it. But those are the times that God does God's best work. And this time is no exception. Yes, Isaiah 34 is all around us, but Isaiah 35 is right there too. In the face of streams turning to pitch, thousands of Native Americans, veterans, religious leaders, activists, mothers, fathers, children alike are converging at Standing Rock this very day to pray and to protect the sacred streams from turning to pitch from the Dakota Access Pipeline. And in the face of land that is burning, in just 13 hours in our very own Cambridge, $87,000 was raised immediately to support those who were impacted by the fire. Covenant, we might not feel ready. The hope and promise of Isaiah 35, maybe right now it sounds Pollyanna-ish. Maybe it sounds empty. The hope and promise of Christmas with its carols and its lights, its tidings of comfort and joy, we might not feel ready for that either. And you know what? These texts today, they tell us that that is okay. That is truly okay. We don't need to always be ready. And our readiness does not stop God. We don't need to quickly embrace a joy or a hope that doesn't feel true quite yet. For some, this may be a season of grieving. For some, this may be a season of shock. This may be a season where Isaiah 34 rings true, and Isaiah 35 seems like a distant, distant fairy tale. That is okay, for God will keep breaking in anyway. God will put reminders in our path that will cause us to stumble out of whatever kind of slumber we might be in. God will work with those who do feel the openness to have a bold voice for hope. And Christmas will come again and again. For whether we are ready or not, God is breaking in. Whether we find ourselves today sitting in the grief of Isaiah 34 or in the promise of Isaiah 35, either one is sacred, either one is just right, and in the midst of both, God is breaking in. Amen.